All right. How y'all doing today? Good? Yeah? Okay. So I'm not going to reread. You guys can read. That's a thing we all can do, I hope. If it's more accessible for you to view this close up, there's a QR code that goes to my Notice site, and that will allow you to view the same slides on your personal device. So if that works better for you, please feel free to do so. Just don't spoil any surprises. Okay. You might remember me from, all the talks I've been doing. I've been talking to us about accessibility, our community, since 2018 or so. I do some stuff on the internet, also Discord. I want to take a minute and talk about why this talk. I'm the product accessibility lead at HashiCorp, and I work on our design systems team. You might have heard of our design system, Helios. I think it's really great. After 27 years in web development, I have finally found the thing. I always thought you could have a team that communicates, that talks back and forth between designers and development, that uses semantic HTML, that, all the things, and it's happening in Helios, and I'm quite pleased. It's been really great to work on. But, you've heard me say this before probably, a design system alone is not going to make an accessible application. And as I've heard executives at certain companies, HashiCorp, say, oh, the design system is how we're going to get to conformance. But no. So I started auditing our products, looking for how are they using our design system components to build their applications? How are they accessible or not accessible? And I started seeing patterns. And I started seeing the same things happening over and over and over again, and they weren't things the design system could fix. So I started taking some notes. And then I started taking some more notes. And then Marco said, will you come speak at Emberfest? And I was like, yes, because I know what I want to talk about. Plus Dublin, so, obviously. So that brings us to my most predictable slide, the agenda. We're going to look at some UI examples, and then we're going to look at how those examples fail for accessibility. We're going to look at what to do instead. PS, there might be some detours. PPS, I've tried really, 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 really hard to fit this into 30 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. Some disclaimers, though, because I am going to be showing you, to talk about in real life on the web patterns, I have to show you in real life on the web code. And some of my colleagues know I'm doing this. Others may be surprised about this. I don't do this to shame anybody. We all have code that we look back on later and think, oh, God, I can't believe I wrote that. Like, I might have even done that like this morning. So it always happens to everybody. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, accessibility is a journey. It's about progress, not perfection. So let's talk first about accessible names. How do you get the accessible name of a thing? In this UI example, you might recognize it. It's very common in technical applications today. You have the ability to add integrations with different products or maybe log in with different platforms. We see these little cards. We see the name of the company that you could potentially integrate with and the little add link. And that will take us to the page where we can perform that action. It's, pretty normal. Where this breaks for accessibility is if you were to visit this page with your screen reader, all these buttons are just, or all these links are just add. So there's no differentiation. And real quick, the mechanism for screen readers to navigate through a site by groups of elements, if you work on a Mac, that uses VoiceOver, and in VoiceOver, they call this a rotor. So I'm going to refer to this as a rotor, but if you use a different screen reader, sometimes they're called web elements. They have different names. So don't be worried if you work on a different platform and you don't see where's the rotor command. No, that's just specific to VoiceOver. So even if a user just tabs through and doesn't use the rotor, they're still going to hear add over and over again. That's not useful, is it? So before we look at how to fix this, I had a kind of, so big companies have these really abstracted pieces of code. So I've kind of condensed this down to the most important bits so we can focus on what's going on here. We see the icon with ARIA hidden true because it's an SVG. We see the name of the potential integration. We see the link to add that integration. Yeah, there should be other stuff there. Again, it's simplified. And we can even imagine, if we close our eyes and dream of CSS, we can imagine how that turned that into that, how that code could become that, right? So we have equally viable options to consider. You can use ARIA label or ARIA labeled by. I think either is fine. And later in this talk, we're going to get into some more specifics about both of these so you can decide what one to use for your specific use case. You'll use different ones at different times. So what to do instead? Let's look at how we would do this with the ARIA label option. You see that we're just going to add the ARIA label to the link. And we're going to concat add with the integration name. I think I did that right. Anyway, I wrote this from memory. And we'll have the same visual result on the screen. And that's the important part. We didn't have to go talk to our designer to get a different design. We could just add this and still have the same thing. And with ARIA labeled by, it's a little more complex, and you'll want to look at this option if you've already got IDs on things, because ARIA labeled by needs the ID reference. So we'll add an ID there, we'll add an ID there, and then we'll put them together there. And that will read the same thing out to us. We'll add GitHub Actions link, which is what we're after. So if we compare the rotor list we saw before with the rotor list after we've fiddled with our code a bit, we can see the difference. Which one would you prefer? You know? Yeah. So there we go. That's what to do instead. And here's a bonus example of making sure that your accordion names have the right accessible name. So you see for the button that's going to expand or collapse, we've got ARIA expanded and ARIA labeled by, and then we have the H2 that is the title. Now notice it's a sibling, it's not tucked inside. And that's really important, y'all. But that accordion title becomes the ARIA labeled by for the button. And because we've got ARIA expanded on there, we don't have to add any extra information. It will say accordion item title expanded, accordion item title collapsed, and give us that information for free. Okay, I did warn you there might be a detour, and guess what? It's time for a detour. Detour into the accessible name and description computation specification. Oh my God, that's a word, mouthful. Okay, we're just gonna call it act name, because if you call it act name, everybody's still gonna know what you're talking about. The detour is happening because I've had too many developers tell me that they don't understand act name, and I guess I'm the co-editor, so I feel kind of responsible. So this is not gonna be a deep dive, but I am gonna explain a few things because I think it's important for us to understand what's going on here. And I'm gonna explain this to you from a few angles. That's why we have this little mindful detour agenda. We're gonna get some context. We're gonna look at the browser instructions, the browser exceptions, and then we're gonna talk about developer guidance, and then we're gonna go a little bit into accessible descriptions. instructions for browsers, and then guidance for developers. So a few things, like this was a list of 20, and I was like, that's too many. Let's knock it down. I knocked it down to 5, and then I was like, okay, that's still too many. Let's try 3. So top 3 things to know about this spec. First, it provides instructions to the browsers for how to calculate the accessible name and accessible description. Now, both might exist. Neither might exist. Browsers need to figure that out because the browser's goal is to return the results to the accessibility object. Now, they will do this for the most part, but they may also do other things if they're convinced they need to do that. To the browser vendor, the primary goal is to deliver some type of accessible name to the end user. They will do whatever they have to do that, and that's where it gets a little weird. So the browsers are supposed to return the first thing they find, looking in this order. They're supposed to look first for an ARIA labeled by attribute. And then they're supposed to look for an ARIA label attribute with a non-empty value. Then, if there's neither of those, look for an ARIA described by, because if we don't have anything that's a label, but we do have a description, we can turn the description into the label. And then look for semantic content, like text of a button element or a label or a legend. Finally, if there's absolutely nothing else, look for the title or placeholder attributes. Not you, browsers. And there's some exceptions to know about, because I don't want you to run into them and be like, what the fuck, Melanie, you told me the wrong thing. So first, we previously noted that they must return the first thing they find. And with the exception of ARIA label, they will return that thing even if it has an empty string. So be careful with your white space. They also may choose to expose something even if it has ARIA hidden on it. Now here we thought, oh, ARIA hidden, we'll just hide it. Bob's your uncle, no worries. They won't touch it, except yes, they will if they feel like they need to. I've had fights with them about this. Nice. Because there's no spec for how browsers should implement exceptions. So they will implement exceptions in the best way they see fit. I don't know. I really just, every time I come across this, I just think, oh, why'd you do that? So if you're not doing weird stuff, you'll probably be fine. But knowing this, these are the reasons I tell you, don't get all bendy with your code. Don't be super clever. Don't bend around backwards. No, do the straightforward, simple thing, because they're already doing bendy things. So how do you, as a developer, prioritize to get an accessible name? Semantic content. The first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. Use HTML wherever possible, please. It's the most reliable thing you can do. If you have something like the accordion title where it has an ID and it can be used, use ARIA labeled by. If no suitable value exists, use the ARIA labeled attribute. I'm thinking icon buttons here. You kind of need that. Do not, just don't, use placeholder or title attributes and expect those to be the accessible name of the element, because they're implemented inconsistently across browsers and screen readers. So please just don't do it. Give them a label. And you may hear some folks saying, well, translations don't translate ARIA label or ARIA labeled by. These are people who are relying on Google Translate in the browser to translate a site. But we're Ember developers and we don't do that, right? We use I18N correctly, right? Quickly, browser instructions for accessible descriptions. So these are, here's the fun part. They can only go look for the description if the description is not already being used for the accessible name. So look for ARIA described by. So ARIA described by, ARIA labeled by, those win in both cases. Then look for the ARIA description attribute, which is fairly new but well supported across browsers. Think of ARIA description like ARIA label, both need a flat string. Then look for elements that are eligible for the description calculation, like the caption element for a table, or the text equivalent computation of a subtree for the summary element. And then the title attribute can be a description, again, if they're not already trying to use it for the accessible name because the accessible name was run. So what will you do as the developer? You're going to prioritize a little different. You're going to use table captions, fig captions, the elements that are there to provide the description. You're going to use the ARIA described by attribute for help text and error text. They take the ID as a value. They can have multiple values. They can even refer to themselves as a value, and that's an interesting, fun thing. You can also use ARIA description, again, flat string. But it's preferred to put the descriptive text in the DOM because you don't want to just, in most cases, you won't want to just offer an accessible description to someone with a screen reader. You want everybody to have that, right? Everybody appreciates that little extra help. Oh, maybe it's tired. Oh, okay, good. Okay, that's the end of the detour. If you have a specific question about the ACNAME spec, or you want to talk more about why it's hard to define white space rules in the ACNAME spec, come talk to me later. Okay, on to the next. So let's look at headings, labels, and instructions. And I grouped it this way because there's WCAG guidance about headings and labels, and then labels and instructions. And in my experience, these things are kind of related in the end anyway. They're related to how you think about your app and how you think about how everything should fit together. So here we are. First up, let's talk headings. So I'm going to give you your cheat sheet. Heading elements for semantic meaning. CSS for styling. Don't put the H3 on the top of the page just because it's a little bit smaller and you like the way that looks by default. I will give you the mommy look if you do that. Okay? Every section should have a heading. Headings should be in order. Browsers will change and expand to support more things over time, but this is your cheat sheet. Start from here. Do this first, and then figure out where you need to be bendy, if at all. Here's a real thing I came across. So if it looks like a heading, and it acts like a heading, but it doesn't sound like a heading, we don't have a heading here, do we? We have an accessibility failure. And there's the link to the failure there. Bummer. So how do you fix that? Well, headings matter because the headings tell the user what the page is about. Users with screen readers can navigate to the next heading with a key press. Users, they can navigate through a list of all the headings like you see here. And you see how they have got 1, 2, 3, 3 through 3, and then goes back to 2. And, you know, that's really useful, right? It allows the user to quickly choose the part of the page that they want, like you could do, all at once, with your eyes. This is why we need to do this in our code, so we can provide that equivalent experience. So what do we do instead? Change it to an H1. Let's think about the modal. A modal, when implemented correctly, will use a dialog element and mark the rest of the page as inert or unusable. And if we think about this from the perspective of the user with a screen reader, either the page exists or the modal exists, but both do not exist at the same time. Now, when we pair this with the 1H1 per page thinking, which I hope you do, we could see modal should have an H1 as their title. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Now let's talk about labels. There's going to be more here, so wait till the end and screenshot that, because then that's your label cheat sheet. Labels must exist. An input label must exist. It must be correct. It must be correctly associated with the input. The label must be informative, so it has to be clear. Users have to understand what information you want from them. And the visible name must be in the accessible name, because some people use speech control. All right? So let's look at a few examples. We have this one input application name, and here's some markup. Let's see, we got a little something that's grouping it. We've got a label element. We've got an input. So does it exist? Yes, the label exists. Is it correctly associated with the input? No. So we've got two failures there. Label for input ID is missing, right? Is the label clear enough? Do you know what you're supposed to put in that input? Application name. Yeah, okay, fine. Is the visible label in the accessible name? No, because the accessible name is blank, because they're not associated correctly. So just doing this, you have 3 failures. Let's look at this one. So we have name, input, and we have the for and the input ID. So we've got a label, yes. They're associated correctly, yes. Is it clear? Name. What kind of name? Your first name, your last name, your full name, your cat's name, application name. It's not clear enough. But the visible name is in the accessible name. So you have just the one failure here. Interesting, right? So here we have cat's name. We've got for and ID. And oh, look at that. Input has an ARIA label. What do you call your cat? So when you're focused on that with a screen reader, it's going to say, what do you call your cat? So we've got a label, 2 really. The label is associated correctly. The label's clear. But the visible label is not in the accessible label, because ARIA label takes precedence and will replace cat's name. So the speech control user can't get to this input field. So what to do instead? For here, we're going to just use the for and the input ID, label for input ID, and we're going to fix it. It's got all the pieces. And if you still want to be helpful to the cat lady, you can change the ARIA label to the ARIA description. It will say cat's name, what do you call your cat? And then you have the full thing and everybody can get to it. So that's nice. As a future cat lady, I can tell you that will be very nice. So please do that for me. Okay, next up, instructions. So this is a real life example. How many accessibility issues do you think you see just by looking at it? There's at least 4 here. Since we already talked about headings being, correctly coded, let's look at the other 3. Delete in all uppercase. This is problematic because not all screen readers treat uppercase letters the way they are supposed to. In addition to that, voice engines. So you know how you go into your voiceover for the first time and you go through the voices and you kind of just pick the one that you can listen to for the most amount of hours? Or at least that's how I did it. I used to always pick the British guy, but then I found out the British guy isn't really coded correctly, so he didn't say things correctly, so I had to pick somebody else. Now I think I'm like Karen from Australia or something like that. And then type delete below. Well, when I'm focused on this input, I get type delete below. Below what? Below where I am now. I'm on the input, so below the input? It's confusing, right? It's also confusing for the sighted user because type delete, there's only one input here. We don't need that. And also the button is disabled, which means the user with the screen reader might not even know that the action button is actually there. Now in VoiceOver, it will say button dimmed, which is your hint that it's disabled, but in other ones, they don't. They just remove it, and you're not going to get that information. So because I have picked the wrong voice engine, I just type delete, but the delete button still doesn't work. So it extra doesn't work. Right. So how do we fix this? We're going to change the help text. So we're going to say type delete, because we're not going to go have the conversation with our designer because they're in a lot of meetings about this new feature and I just can't get a hold of them. So we're going to try to make the smaller changes that will still make it work. So we'll say type delete parentheses all caps to delete this application. We'll say confirm delete. So we've made it a little more clear what we were asking for them. And we're going to leave it enabled because we're going to rely on our validation to make sure that nothing happens to the user's data if they haven't done this correctly. And we remove the word below too. So we've just improved this whole thing for everyone. Now, let's hope our validation is wired up correctly, yeah? All right, so next, reflow, resize, and space. Okay, so I've got about 4 minutes, so we're gonna see. Good, okay, you're lucky. I'll have to cut out some of my lectures. Okay, so reflow, resize, and space. This is 3 WCAG success criteria that relate to Zoom, text resizing, and spacing of text. Now, you might have heard this at work. We're a desktop app. We don't support mobile. And then you get a bunch of designs with fixed pixel widths everywhere, which is kind of Figma's fault, but it's mostly Figma's fault. Because yes, maybe they don't do things in relational units, but we can do maths, depending on where you're from. So I don't really accept the excuse. Responsive web design taught us a long time ago. Target divided by context equals result. That's pretty easy formula. Use it all the time and win. Also, it's 2024 and you don't support mobile. Are you sure? But fine, time is money and money is constraints. Let's think about the outcomes. What are we trying to do here? We are trying to support browser zoom up to 400%. We are trying to support users up to doubling the text size, font size. And we're trying to support increased space for all text. So here's a real life example of reflow that didn't go so well. Here's the before. I blurred out the other parts of the page, but we've got this banner here. And then when I start to zoom in, oh no, the content starts to be clipped. And when I have it all the way zoomed in, you can't even see any of it. It just all goes away. And here's another example, before zoom. Very nice, accessibility, woohoo. And when we zoom into 400%, we still get all the content because it's been done correctly. And I'm going to say this testing zoom mostly applies to increased text size as well, because we have gotten the feedback from users that while they could go into the browser settings and change the font size, they typically just zoom in with browser zoom. So it's an okay thing to do now. Text spacing has some really specific things it wants to do. So let's look at a before and after. So here's before text spacing has been applied, and here's after. And I had to kind of shrink it. It's actually much bigger than that, but you can see, what I want you to see is the spacing between the letters between the words after the paragraphs, all of that has to be able to change. And there's 4 different things that it needs. So I say have a CSS class that you can turn on for testing, or use a bookmarklet. That's what I do. It's just in my browser, so I can go just press it and check. And honestly, what you want to do, how do you do this? Well, relational units, unitless line heights, grid and flexbox for your CSS, and make sure you test. In the end, supporting these things kind of looks a lot like responsive web design and mobile support, doesn't it? I know there's more to it than that, but if you meet these accessibility criteria, you sort of get some responsive design for free. And also, Beep endorsed my framing of this, so you can take that to the bank. Okay, so let's put all these things together. WCAG success criteria are literally the bare minimum that people with disabilities need to interact with websites. And we're talking about banking, paying their bills. When's the last time you tried to pay a bill in person? How hard was that? Like, everything is online these days. So we all have a responsibility to think about this. And if it's not your cup of tea or it's not your area of expertise, find the person on your team who does have that expertise and work with them. All right? So I'm not saying go learn this stuff. Well, I am. But if you can't, find someone else on your team who does and work as a team. That's what we're here for, to support each other as colleagues. I want you to think about the next steps. What's the outcomes that you're after? What's the next level? How can you as a company level up? And you might be saying, how can we go beyond? How can we level up? Well, I have some ideas for you. Outline WCAG internally and give links, and explain how your products commit to doing more about design. What is your process for code? How are you going to test? What's your release process going to look like? Get accessibility checks into your design and development lifecycle, and have it checked before you release it, please. And be a little selfish. So there's this thing called an age burst. I'm going to be about 3 more minutes. Because I want to talk to you about this age burst thing. I was reading about it the other day in National Geographic, and I'm experiencing it for the first time in my mid-40s. Play a video game for a day, have tennis elbow for a month. Hear a sudden noise and turn your head too quickly, your neck just hurts now. That's just the way it is. One day you need reading glasses. You've had 20/20 vision your whole life, and then one day you need reading glasses. And 6 months later, you need a stronger one. And your doctor says your eyes will settle down. And you don't know if you believe them, because this is all really weird. What is happening? And everything just kind of hurts. So be a little selfish. Try it with your keyboard. Can you navigate through the UIs you create with a keyboard only? Check the color contrast, because you might even be one of those people that's like, oh, I like reduced contrast. Well, guess what? Eventually you'll hate it, and you'll be like, why is there so many things that I can't read anymore? So check the color contrast. And use browser zoom. Again, with our eyes, you're going to be zooming in because everyone loves tiny fonts. So there you go. That's just going to be your life now. But check that, because you want to make sure that you can see all of the content, because someday this might affect you. And you're saying, well, Mel, I won't use these apps when I'm old, or it will be rewritten by then anyway. Every single developer in this room will influence someone else. You pass on things to the other developers around you, whether you mean to or not. And if you create this process, if you create this culture of doing it this way, then you're passing it on, and that's what's important. All right. Y'all know I say this at the end, so here we are. You do not require permission to create accessible code. It doesn't have to be explicitly stated in the requirements. You don't have to be specifically told to do it. You do not require permission. Just create accessible code. And as the Irish would say, I've learned, cop on. Thank you.